Hi, you've joined us at Art Direction from designer to director to artist. This is a panel about art direction, kind of. My name is Jason Morningstar. My pronouns are he, him. I was sort of the creative client on the project that we're going to use as an example. And you can find me at Pulpit Games, which is my company, bullypulpitgames.com. And I'm very fortunate to have with me the two collaborators on this particular example project, Jabari Weathers and Brennen Reece. So, Jabari, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hey, as Jason said, I'm Jabari Weathers, they, them pronouns. I'm an illustrator based in Baltimore, Maryland. I also dabble in game designer and as a game designer and games writer. Um, and I'm excited to talk about what we're going to get into today. You can find other examples of my work at goblinprincet.com and follow me on the same handle, Goblin Princet on Twitter. Princet is Princete. So, yeah.
And Brennen.
And I'm Brennen Reece. Pronouns are he, him. I am the art director and graphic designer over at Pulpit Games. I also do some illustration. You can find my work at brennenreece.com or on Instagram at @brennenreece. I guess that's pretty much it. Back to you, Jason.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I love you both. I love what you do. I'm so excited that we all got to work together on this project.
Me too.
And I think that it's turned out great. Let me just explain the project so that people understand sort of the parameters of what we're talking about. I think this is broadly applicable in a lot of different ways, but I think knowing kind of the project will be helpful. So this is a game that's in process. It's essentially designed. We have prototypes, but it hasn't been published yet. It's called Dead House, and it is a sort of role-playing card game that I designed. It uses a deck of cards to tell the story about the winter of 1888 in a little town called Neola, Kansas. And it's a very dark game, sort of survival horror, I guess would be one way to look at it. But it's also rooted in place in a really fun and interesting way. So it's a game it's a role-playing game. It's card-based, and those are two things that create a set of affordances that influence everything that we did. And so that's the game Dead House that we're talking about. And when I conceived of this game, I realized that I would need the help of a professional to set the parameters for what we needed for art, right? And Brendan was the perfect person to do that. So Brendan came on as the art director of this project, helped create an art brief for what we wanted, and then we went out and looked at a number of different people who might be able to meet the brief in a way that we liked. And it's a weirdly specific brief, and I want to talk about that too. But Jabari clearly was the one that we wanted to work with on this, both from a stylistic point of view and a professional point of view. We had met, and there was, I think, Jabari, there's a lot of, oh yeah, I'd like to work with you at some point in the future. For a couple of years, we kind of did a little dance until we found the right project. Oh, but this was it. This was the first project where those pieces kind of fell in place. So that's Dead House. That's kind of how we came together. And I think maybe the thing to do is we can look at the brief that we created. We can talk about how that turned into like a piece of work, and then we can actually look at the work in progress. Does that sound like a good plan to the two of you? Are there other things that
Yeah, sure.
that we should cover before that?
No,
Okay.
I think that's a good way to do it.
All right. So we're going to go to a 4-panel layout, one of which is going to be my screen shared. And I'm going to get a thumbs up that that's happened.
Looks good.
So what we're seeing on the screen here is a Google Doc that Brennan and I put together that is the brief that we worked up and then presented to Jabari. So I'm going to go through this kind of briefly, and then just to give an overview of what this is. And then maybe we can go back and Brennan, I'd love for you to talk about why some of these things are the way they are.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about in this brief, the number of pieces. We're talking about the dimensions of those pieces. We're talking about the resolution that we need. what we handle and what the artist will handle, and then some examples of what it might end up looking like. It ended up looking like none of these things, but the idea was hopefully to give the artist an idea of what we're looking for. Um, some more detailed, this is essentially restating visually what the actual pieces are going to look like. Um, and then again, just some more mock-ups that I put together, just sort of my idea of what it might be like. Understanding that it was going to change both in art direction and in the final art. We provided a PDF of those dimensions if necessary, a big folder full of reference photos and illustrations, and I'm very anxious to talk to you about that, Jabari, to see if that was useful to you.
Yeah.
And then it gets into like this is the designer, the game designer piece of it. I had some very specific ideas about how I wanted this to look, um, and I give some suggestions, right? Of what I think it might be like and things that are deal breakers for me. So, like for me, a deal breaker is it has to look period appropriate and it can't look like game art. And
Mhm.
I know that Brennan, you're with me on that one. Uh,
I am on a decade-long campaign to make game art that does not look like game art.
and,
That was
and
actually a big hook for me too.
I'm so glad.
Honestly,
I
like
mean,
that was the hook in the mouth.
I kind of knew. I kind of knew, right?
Yeah.
So again, here's some examples of things that I was excited about. This sort of dark, saturated pen and ink kind of look, and there are a variety of ways to go with that. But none of them look like game art, and that's the point there. And then some specifics about the individual pieces that are necessary for the game. There are images of people, there are images of locations, and there are some game icons. And for each of the people, they get basically a log line. This guy should be dressed maybe like a cowboy. He's handsome. He's lazy. He should be an African American man. This person's a sullen teenager, right? That's really all that was given there. And hopefully, this gives you a sense of the trust that I was placing both in the direction and the execution of the art, because you're not given a bunch of information, and hopefully this combined with the game text is enough to really make it sing, and you know it was. So descriptions of the buildings, right? This is a it's a barn, but it's a very squared away barn, etc. And that's it, right? This is 5 pages of material that is intended to give the artist what they need. So, Brennan, can we talk about this? Because I know we went back and forth, and you had some very
Yeah.
strong opinions about individual pieces of this. So,
Mhm.
let's talk about that.
Do we want to just kind of go through the brief line by line and hit on the appropriate topics as we? So
Let's do it. Let's do it quickly.
okay.
Let's sort of
Right.
pick your most important points.
Yeah, yeah. So a few things in terms of just the technical aspects is uh, most of the time when you work with illustrators, they will deliver the final file at 300 DPI. Um, I prefer to work at 450 DPI or even 600 DPI because there might be a part of that art that we can reuse at we can zoom in, we can crop things. I like to be able to move around, and not everyone is as skilled as Jabari, and like I might have to like recrop something or recompose something. So I like having that freedom. You can always shrink it down, but if you go larger, you end up having something really ugly and pixelated. So just in terms of technique, um, always create much larger than your final output. That's something the old comic book and commercial illustrators would do. They would always design it at 2 to 4 times the size, do their ink drawings. They're not really working that tight at the actual size. It's much looser when you see the working piece. Another thing that Jason we put together is, and this was a lesson we learned several times over and over, is you should always work on building the typography into the layout and having safe area, because a lot of times people will put an illustrator will put something that's important right next to the edge of the illustration and it might get cut off, or they'll design this incredible piece of art, and there's nowhere to put the actual text, which is probably the most important part. So actually composing the image with the text in mind is it. I mean, the illustration is, as well as being a piece of art, it's mainly an element in the design. So the illustration and the typography work together. And if you don't create the illustration with the typography in mind, it creates problems. And I've gotten the opportunity to design several beautiful book covers that were going to look different just because the original artwork was not created with actually putting the book title on it. So those are the kind of technical art direction things. Jason, Jabari, any comments?
Let me hop over to the actual art and we'll show that progression. And we'll come back to this as well when we talk about sort of the process from pencils to final product. But just to give you an idea of how these notes became very important. Like we very specifically in the brief said, make sure there's room for text. And what you see, so we're looking at an initial pencil of one of these landscape pieces of a building. This is the final piece, and you can see that we've got room to work with this. And so what this ends up being put into a card layout with plenty of room on the bottom here to add text to explain what this is. We can look at another one. Same deal. Here's the pencil. Here's ink, and then the final piece. We lose no detail. We lose no information in the piece after it's been formatted to include text because Jabari knew because we told them that that's how it had to be.
Mm-hmm. Velma was also kind of our trial run too. I knew that there was going to be text. I saw the earlier layout, like kind of prototypes that were included in the art brief, but like I didn't know if the text was going to end up being above or below or like off to the side or so. Like the smaller details were things that we were kind of designing around, and you can see Velma is kind of like positioned at about like halfway height here, whereas the others kind of got scooted up a little bit more to like 2/3 of an eye level in terms of where the most interesting parts of their face were.
Right. So here's Henry Hetzel, which was later in the process and was easier to fit because of that. Which is, I think that's a good segue into talking about what what the workflow process here was. So do you want to talk about that, Jabari?
Yeah. Where to start? So there were a lot of interesting things going on in terms of like going into working on this project because kind of chasing this like woodcut look for Dead House in the first place, I was like, yes, like I totally want to do this. I want to do something that feels like really evocative and quietly morbid. There is kind of a subtlety to what you both were asking me for in the brief that I don't get folded into a lot of other games art prompts that I have. And so kind of being on the similar page of like we want to make something visually challenging in that way and kind of eye-opening was really exciting for me. The process, we actually, so as I said, like Velma was kind of our trial run for a lot of different things in terms of like what process I would use, like how we were treating layout and like where more or less the portraits would at least have to land. She was also where I was like figuring out a lot of like my mark making and how I would go about this. I've never done a woodcut. I've wanted to for a while, but like while I'm a fan of a lot of like German expressionist woodcuts and like think about the kind of mark making that you see there, I translate that into like working in a pen and quill and ink or like a brush. So that was the best approximation that I had to like kind of fake a lot of that same feeling. And you can tell that it looks like it doesn't look like how a woodcut actually usually looks, like the kind of decisions that are made and just how a block of wood would force a printmaker to make marks is different from a lot of my decision making. But a lot of the ways that I'm treating shapes and like turning the faces into different planes and adding these hatch marks were the things that I kind of let inform my visual decision making here.
And I think it's important to note too that like this was um, we had a constrained budget and needed to set this up in a way that was equitable for you, as
Mhm.
well as was going to get us something that we wanted. And part of that balance is that we sort of gave you permission to define the style,
Yeah,
and that there wasn't going to be a ton of revision once we understood the process and we're comfortable with your work.
right.
um, and that's unusual for us. Normally we're a little more hands-on with multiple versions and iterations of the pieces, but
Mhm.
we had confidence in you, and that was a compromise that made everything work better, I think, ultimately. So I
The
just want to
workflow
And
was
and I
really
think that I'm sorry. I think that's something that Bully Pulpit's really been pushing for too. Is we choose our artists based on the fact that we like those artists, and we're not trying to choose a generic illustrator who can do what we want them to do in any style. We're choosing someone because we're a fan of the work and we think they're awesome, and we want to see what they can bring to the table. And so, in a lot of
totally.
ways, from an art direction point of view, Jason's doing the game design, and I'm doing the art direction and the graphic design. And we've already chosen the artist because we know whatever they're going to do is going to be awesome. We're not, it's not like we're coaching them and holding their hand every step of the way. We don't want to micromanage. We want it to be an opportunity for us to showcase incredible art in our games.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that's been very successful for us. And it's really nice to, when you have confidence in an artist, to be surprised by how they interpret your work. That's a pleasure for me. I really enjoyed that. And
And
in this
I
case,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead, jump in.
And people too tend to do their best work when they're given the freedom to do the work they want to do.
Mhm. That
Did
was
you?
definitely something that was refreshing about working on this. Like I did feel trusted in the process, even like the way that the check-ins work uh that we had, like basically after Velma was completed from start to finish, and like we were kind of on the same page of how I was going to be finishing all of the art. uh I penciled everything else at the same time, the other 25 cards, sent them to Jason, so that both of you could like look over and like say like these are working. We had, and then like we had some discussion about like which way to pull certain things. I think some of the images were a little bit um, confusing at that point. Like there is a balance of like, does this need to be clarified, or like is this something that you're just going to trust me on? I think Hell in particular at its pencil stage was one of the most ambiguous. Um,
Yes. Yeah. Well, I remember all of the iconic ones. I was like, I don't know, man. I don't know if this is right. And you were like, no, trust me, it's good. And I was like, I trust you. It'll be good, and it totally is. Yeah.
yeah, and it was useful to still like hear those misgivings, because like that got folded into like how I was finishing them. It was like, okay, these details are not singing the way that I want. I think that this composition works and is generally spooky and kind of upsetting in the way that I want, but there are things that need to be fine tuned. So it was still good to hear those points of feedback moving
Yeah.
into finalizing them.
And you took a wonderful approach. So the card that I have on the screen right now is the image for fall or autumn, and time passes. So there's a fall card, a winter card, and then a hell card, because the winter doesn't stop. In 1888, the winter just kept going, and so you're looking out a window, and things aren't right, but the details are subtle enough that you really have to take a moment to take it in before you realize how messed up things really are, which turned out to be a really great choice. Um, so you see there's permanence, but there's also change, and that change is very bad,
Yeah,
which is exactly right. So that was not really me, it was you bringing it, and I really appreciate that.
it was also one of the other two of the other things about the process here. One, I actually really appreciated how how open the briefs were in a lot of ways, or like how succinct, I should say, the briefs were, because it allowed me to like really project onto it and kind of solve them. Sometimes a lot of what I will run into when I'm getting art direction from clients, and it makes sense, it has its merits to handle this way, is I get a lot of art direction that starts to feel like stage direction and like really particular, to the point where it encroaches on like how I'm supposed to compose a certain story. And I'm like, okay, this is a lot of information to pack into this, to the point where it's actually muddling the story that I think this image is supposed to tell. And here I could really hone in on like, how do I make this character feel this way, or how do I make this place feel similarly to the brief that I'm getting. The other thing that I was kind of struck by is like, this isn't a style that I typically work in, and it was I think the closest analog in my portfolio to this was the Tarot of Servants work for Bluebeard's Bride, and that was more in kind of the attitude, like in some ways, like the shape language and like the mark making here is like much louder than Bluebeard's Bride. It's much more pronounced because I'm trying to emulate that woodcut look, but the elements of unease and horror and distress are like turned down, or those uneasy aspects were brought to ground a little bit more. It's less of a fantastical approach. So leaning into that challenge of trying to like find that balance was really exciting.
But at the same time, so I really stress in the brief that I want this to be, it doesn't have to be realistic, but it has to be grounded. But at the same time, like I look at the piece that's on the screen right now, Henry Hetzel, and like look at his knuckles, right? They just communicate anxiety in a way that is just gorgeous and that I absolutely adore. Yeah, it was a great fit, and I'm glad you were drawn to the project, because I think you really internalized what we were after and delivered it in a very satisfying way.
This is just my brain space all the time, so it's cool. Like, trying to externalize that in as clear a way as possible, but also in this way that I hadn't been asked to before, was very fulfilling.
That is super great. Hey, let's see if we have any questions. Just sort of we're midway. Are there questions in the chat? If not, we'll just continue.
At the moment, there are no questions.
Okay.
But this is a good time to ask the audience vocally as well as in typing to start thinking of some questions.
Yep, that is great. So if you're curious about anything related to the process or the roles that we play in a project like this, feel free to ask us some questions. We'll reserve time at the end to answer them as best we can, and then we'll all be hanging around here and there, and we can answer questions later too. So, Brennen, what does an art director do?
Well, an art director makes sure that the illustrations go into the game, and they end up serving the I mean, there's a lot to that. I mean, you're trying to establish the look. You're trying to pick the artist. You're trying to make sure that everything comes in on schedule and under budget, ideally. You're doing a lot of communication. Not so much with Jason, but sometimes there might be some conflicts. There might be some vision issues. But the fun part of art direction for me is going through and trying to find something that I feel evokes the flavor of the game, and doing a lot of research, and looking at, like Jason mentioned before, it has to fit the historical period. It has to kind of fit that atmosphere, that ambiance. And I go through and just look at tons and tons and tons of art and try to find something, and then I try to find an artist who I feel can bring that same kind of energy, that same kind of feeling to the illustration, and give it something fresh, something that's of themselves, something original. one of the things that, I really love about Jabari's work is that, in particular, that's, there's definitely some tradition, there's definitely, some influences, but it's Jabari's work. And this is something that with, all of the artists that we work with Bully Pulpit, they're not copying anyone. They're not a second-rate Mike Mignola. They're not they're not trying to be Mobius. They're not trying to be Frank Frazetta. They have their own vision. And it's very important to me as an artist that when I work with other artists as an art director, that we choose people who can bring something that no one else is doing. And the Bully Pulpit Games, Jason's work is very original. There's nothing else out there in terms of the games. No one writes games like Jason, for better or for worse. And they're beautiful original things. They're art, and they deserve art that honors that. So we need something that's original, something that is sometimes shocking, not something that's just watered down copies of something that everyone else is doing. So I'm very happy with how this project turned out.
So let me ask you, and I'm going to ask you these similar questions to Jabari, so prepare yourself mentally. So you mentioned that, Brennan, that you and I are pretty simpatico. We get
Yes.
along pretty well and have pretty similar visions for what these products should end up being like. How do you handle, as an art director, a client who maybe is misguided or disagrees with you, and what are the aspects of a good client that you want to see? How can a client help you be a better art director?
Well, so this is I'm grouchy. And I, with you, I don't have to worry about this because we have our visions are pretty much on the same level and we communicate well. If I'm working as an art director, as an artist, for another client, it's this is maybe not the friendliest way to go about it, but I'll tell them, you guys hired me because you like my work. You didn't hire me to do what you said, how you did it. I'm not here to operate as software. I'm not here to push pixels. I'm here because you saw something in my work that you loved and you respected, and you wanted me to bring that. So the best way that I can work for someone else, for another client, is I can say, get out of my way and let me do my job. Give me input. But I'm not just going to listen to somebody and say, as you know, I'm not going to just say yes to everything. I'm gonna push back on things, and I think it's very important for artists and designers and writers to not think of themselves so much as hired guns who are just going to do whatever, but it's important, as an artist, as an art director, as a writer, you're being hired because you're the expert. And once you put something out there, your name's on it, if it's not up to par for your own standards, then you're kind of watering down your own brand, you're lowering the bar for yourself. And for me, that's unacceptable. So yeah, when I'm working with another client, it's always, well, it's almost always worked out well. But I've had to have that, sit down, come to Jesus moment where I say, look, you want this, let me do my job. I'll give you something beautiful. I'll give you something as good as anything I've ever done, but just, get out of my way and let me do what you like me for.
Okay, Jabari, so the same question related to the client. In this case, maybe filtered through the art director, maybe not. But interactions, what are the things that make a client that you just love to work with?
Yeah, I think what Brennen speaks to is trust in why a client is hiring you, or why an art director is reached out to you and is hiring you. That they are reaching out to you for your perspective, I still, as someone who's in the first decade of my career still, like, I feel this precariousness often of like, I want to advocate for my own voice, but I also don't want to push away new professional ties and established ones by essentially like being too combative. But at the same time, I think that it's really important to recognize where your voice fits. So when someone has hired me and it's clear to me that they kind of understand how I think even more so than like what kind of marks I make on a page, and like why that conversation is going to go well, that is what's exciting to me. I really do struggle with art direction that like kind of dictates staging, because I find that most constraining.
Can you define what you mean by staging?
So like when on occasion, like sometimes it really makes sense when like a camera angle is like kind of delineated, but I'd rather like have the scene of something like a group of adventurers looks down a waterfall at like a large dragon rather than like we look up from the dragon's perspective at three like
Right.
adventurers and like, okay, you've already picked out this image rather than leaving it to me to tell the story that you've like laid out. And it seems like a subtle difference, but it's actually like a really heavy weight. When I get art direction or I get clients, because I usually am actually working directly with clients in the indie space, when I get art direction that leaves the way a story is told to me up to me more so, and then like lets that become an ongoing conversation after like the sketches are fulfilled and such, that feels really fruitful and really healthy for me. And even though that requires a little bit more back and forth sometimes to kind of suss out both like what is working for me and what's honoring my perspective in the collaboration, I find that it's easier for me to make space for what a client is looking for as well, even if what they're looking for it hasn't completely been articulated or kind of gets discovered through the process of seeing what I'm doing with sketches.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So just to sort of invert that a little bit as the client, I don't know, I'm sure everybody's different, but for me, this whole process is when it goes well, when you're making those decisions thoughtfully and successfully, it's such a joy because what I really want is my vision realized in a way that surprises and delights me. And if the art director does their job and the artist does their job, and if you let them do it, then you're very likely to get that result for the reasons that you both just described. So, like, I feel like a kid in a candy store when I'm in process with a job like this, and I see that there's a new attachment in my email with a sketch or a new piece or a finished piece of work because I know I'm going to be excited to see it. And even if it's not quite right, it's not going to be what I thought it was, and we can kind of go from there. But it's a very fun process from the client point of view. And maybe part of that is because I don't micromanage, and I recognize that that's a bad habit that I don't want to get into. And in terms of working with art directors, I don't know, Brennan, it's been me and you for so long. I don't know that I have any real words of wisdom for what makes a good art director. I think you're great. But
I
it's
agree.
hard for me to clarify that because we kind of think alike.
Yeah.
We're both kind of rooted in certain aesthetics that we find deeply pleasant and that form a shorthand that just kind of works and is communicated through our products, I think, a lot.
Well, I think one of the things that makes your game so interesting is that you're always kind of immersing yourself in these periods and these situations, and you're reading about them constantly, and you're finding inspiration in all of these stories, and you're just you have this incredible imagination for game design, and a lot of that comes from the things you consume as a reader. And I think the same thing is true of me as an artist and art director. it's, I'm not only looking at, what's in the latest edition of the world's most popular role-playing game, and I'm not trying to copy that as an artist. And like I'm always looking at uh, typography from the entire history of the written and printed word, and I'm looking at graphic design, and I'm looking at photography, and I'm looking at art, and I'm not doing it as a professional thing. I'm doing it because I love looking at art. I find inspiration, and I look at it, it's like, man, I really like the way these two typefaces combine, and it's, maybe it's weird, but like I get really excited about typefaces, and I get really excited about juxtapositions of textures and photographs, and color harmonies, and learning new tricks, and so I think that a good art director is someone who understands art, someone who understands graphic design, someone who understands how all the things fit together, and they have a context to place them in. um, when I've been working as an illustrator for clients who are serving an art director role, I didn't necessarily have they didn't necessarily have that context to work in. So, it was more like I was kind of art directing myself and hoping they would like it, and the process was very cumbersome. Um, but it's just that passion about having the job, really. I think, like being passionate as both a creator and a consumer of whatever it is that you do. Jabari, I imagine that you look at an awful lot of art, and you have a lot of art that you love, and you probably have, like Jason and I, extremely strong opinions about art, and right. So, and I think that's very important, to have things you're passionate about, and things that you like very much, and things that you don't like very much, and to have that kind of creative integrity, and the historical basis to build it on, and um, to know what's popular, and sometimes to not do something because it's popular.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true.
In terms of the way that both of you immerse yourselves into understanding visual art, um, and like deeply investigating that, I think that was actually one of the things that made me want to work with you, Jason, and then later on you, Brennan, like very specifically, because like whenever I look at posts online, or sometimes like I think I referred to this back at the beginning of the panel, like, Jason, I heard you like making plans about like what you were looking for other projects that I didn't work on, but just like asking me about like, do you know any artists that work this way, um, on like a collection of portraits or such. And but then like the way that you were talking about uh, what you needed it was very specific and very astute, in a way where I was like, I could think of artists who would sync up with us rather than just like a list of what you didn't want.
Sure.
and and that speaks to like an excitement and a consciousness of how visual art works that I think is a little bit unusual in terms of how I'm directed.
It sounds like that's one of the things that we can agree is an advantage for anybody in any of these three roles, which is to be broadly curious, and to be looking for sources of inspiration and discovery outside of games, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
hey,
Um,
I put up the picture of the hell card
Uh,
just as the example of that subtlety. So here's autumn, right? And we see things are not right, but they're not terrible. And then we're moving to winter, and here you get this. Now there's a bird, right? Things are still a little weird. There's some creepy footprints, but like it's winter, it's cool. Everything's going to be fine. And then the hell card brings all that together in such a nice way. So that's just I wanted to share that example of what were talking about. And I had originally been reluctant about the sequence, and it turned out to be right on, like
mhm.
perfect, perfect.
I think a lot of the early missteps, even in the pencils phase that I had with this, was just that like the ingredients weren't reading. So like when I went to like talk with you about like here's what I'm trying to convey, it seemed like what was going on in my head was making more sense than like where it was at the halfway point. And so like there were certain things like the silhouette of the dead bird in the hell card didn't quite read correctly, and it's still like a little, like for me it's still like a little bit like it takes a second, but if you lean into it you can kind of tell like what's going on there, and it leans on the previous cards.
Yeah, right. It's sort of sequential art in that way. Like that bird is present in the autumn card as well.
Yeah.
Or there are birds in the frame, and then they're still there on the hell card, which is great. But you have to take a moment, and that is an ambiguous and scary image, because I don't know what's happening there, why someone's walking in a circle. Like the whole thing is really spooky, and it's just perfect. Very, very happy with it. So let's. I'm going to go back and see if there are questions. If there are any questions now.
Got a few.
We do actually have a question.
Okay.
This is from Kevin Culp. How long did it take for Jabari to produce the art and for Brennen to declare it final from start to finish?
It's a good question. I have no memory of that. But Brennen, do you have a recollection? Either of you?
Well, I can tell you that when Jabari's final pieces came in, they were, I mean, they're beautiful. So I don't know. Was it a couple of months or something?
It was over 2.5 month process.
Okay.
I think there were a few different factors happening outside. It was in the middle of a move at the beginning of the project.
Yeah, I think we had budgeted in the contract for like 2 months, and it ended up being 2.5.
Okay.
Something like that.
It's always good to be in the middle of a move when you're doing traditional media.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's also always good to just be flexible about these things, right?
Yeah.
Like if you can build cushion into your schedule, then you should. Just because life is going to get in the way,
Right.
you need to be tolerant of that, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least I feel that way. That's what I want for myself, so I want that for others as well.
So Jabari, what is the about the average time it took you to work on each piece
on these cards? I would say it's a wildly varying range. So I was about to say like the total hourly gamut for everything from pencils to final was between 130 and 150 hours.
Okay.
I think, which is actually a little bit fast since it was across 26 pieces. But some of these were like, oh, this is like done in 2 hours. Like I had a really clear idea of where things were going. Others, like I had a few different points where like I was redrawing the pencils and like not quite sold myself before I would even like push them forward to both of you. And the land, like the all of the different settings in particular took a little bit more finessing for me. So like where some of the portraits might be like 2 or 3 hours and like really quick to pencil out, at least the settings sometimes like they would take like 5 or 6 hours to pencil out, or like even up to 10 if I was looking for like a really specific. Unfortunately, like in the art direction and in some of our correspondence, both of you were providing me with like good like handholds and reference points for like what kind of things to reference. But then it was a matter of like figuring out like what's the best size to work at to also keep this efficient and such. So I think on average the pieces probably come out to like 7 or 8 hours.
Okay. But
some of the actual like some of the more involved ones ended up taking like 15 hours. And some of them would take like 3 from pencils to final.
I've found that when I'm working on a piece, it's the ones that I just really knock through that take the least amount of time that almost always turn out the best.
Mm-hmm.
The ones I put the least amount of effort in are almost always the best pieces, and the ones that I'm absolutely in love with and I think I've been very clever, and they no one likes them.
That so that was something that I was fighting too. Like some of like I'm sure that like looking at this, it's like kind of bizarre to hear those numbers of hours, but I'm including like things that a lot of decision making and trial and error that like either of you also haven't seen, because I'm like, okay, this looks too overthought to the point where like the way that the thinking is appearing on the page actually doesn't fit the visual objectives that we've outlined. Like this looks too precious because I normally have a more precious hand than this. So in some ways, like the way that I was trying to be precious in these images was by faking a more naive hand, and that's actually really hard.
Yeah. Oh, are there other questions?
Yeah, I have one other question at this point. It's for Jason and Brennen. When in the game design process is the art brief created? Is it toward the editing phase? Is it held off into the layout phase? How early is it considered?
Great question. I think in this case, and this is going to be unique to the way that you work or the way that your company works. But for us, I wanted to lock this game down and be completely confident that it was going to be a product that we were going to produce before we started with the art. And so we did a ton of play testing with mock-ups, with like real pretty straightforward art that I put together. And then we got serious about putting together a brief. Does that sound right, Brennen?
Yeah. I think I've lost my camera. You guys can still hear me though?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think for this, that's right for this, but for a lot of the games we do, I started thinking about the art and the graphic design very early on, and I think Jason and I are always passing art and graphic design examples back and forth in Slack. I'll wake up in the morning and Jason sent me some beautiful piece of Russian constructivism, or like some Polish technical manual for plumbers from 1949, and I was like, I feel seen.
You are seen, my friend.
Yes, so
it's a beautiful relationship we have.
Indeed. But yeah, I think and I think probably part of the way that Jason works is with a lot of the prototyping, and I'm guessing just from the evidence, but it probably helps your design to have a little bit of graphic design and a little bit of art to kind of inspire you and give you that feel. And I know during my own failed attempts at game design, I would always just go ahead and design the game while I was doing the graphic design and the art at the same time, because it made it fun.
Yeah. Well, certainly, yeah. I'm a design thinker, so often I will have things in layout that help me think about the way the game's going to work in a way that just having it in text might not, which is different from designing in layout, which I try very hard not to do. But sometimes it makes sense to build pages and figure out how things are going to flow or look as inspiration, for sure. In terms of art, I don't know that I agree with that. Like art, it doesn't inspire me in the design process. Certainly images do. And in a historical game, there'll be I'll be constantly grabbing images and putting them in a folder, both for my own reference and then later on as an art reference. And I wanted to ask you, Jabari, was that useful to you? I gave you a folder full of images from 1888, people, hairstyles, hats, buildings. Did you consult that?
I did, but it was actually like kind of a bridge to do more of my own research. So it was appreciated. Fortunately, like these were periods that I was at least like decently familiar with. I have a library of reference that I just literally have a lot of books that I'm in the middle of packing up for another move that include a lot of references that I was also using, but like this pointed me in the right direction for like, where should I look in these books? Which artists are you looking at? Fortunately, this is also something like the markers that you were pulling from were things that I was already into.
Yeah.
So
that's very good.
Yeah.
Hey, a technical staff, can we go back to the 3-person layout?
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
And it seems like there's actually a few other questions as well.
Oh, well, let's answer them.
Oh no, the stream.
Okay, this one's for Jabari. It happens to be from Steve, Jason's partner at Bully Pulpit. Jabari, publishers see a lot of solicitations from artists with very traditional RPG art, fantasy, anime styles, etc., in their portfolios. Do you have advice for other artists on how to broaden their styles and offerings for games?
Yeah, look at a lot more things. like definitely breathe in a lot more influences, and like don't be closed off to that. And also challenge what your notions are of like what genre is. This gets into a little bit of like muddy detail because a lot of my history in my career thus far has been working with indie publishers who are willing to let me like get weird. Like I think that I have a weird hand for what people assume is role-playing game art. But if we're talking about like Bully Pulpit, who's looking for idiosyncratic approaches to the visual stylings to match the design that is equally unique, then I think it makes sense for people to like be really curious and like let a lot more things wash over what they make. And also like with those pretty straightforward genres, like challenge yourself to bend those genres more toward like what they mean to you. Like I do consider myself a fantasy artist and like a horror artist in a lot of ways, but I try to fold a lot of my own perspective and a lot of my own texture, my textural obsessions, into how I approach fantasy. And can talk about that for hours, of course, but like that alone I think really feels differently. Like it shows, I assume, from how both of you talk about my work, like it shows that like I'm thinking about even those genres in a more specific way. I'm not looking at it and saying like this has to be a digital painting that's like very high gloss. Often like when I think of fantasy, I'm like, how, like what touches me and like what feels fantastical and like what feels a little bit startling, and like fantasy is a little bit scary to me. Like what does it feel like to those other artists? What feels truthful to them? And it's really hard, I think, to answer that question yourself, especially if you're digesting kind of the same 5 things that everyone else is. So yeah, expose yourself to a lot of things. Like if I'm doing a piece, for example, that's like a D&D piece, I'm probably like putting on a Peter Greenaway film in the background, or like listening to like I'm listening to like the soundtrack to like some A24 horror film, like probably like the In Fabric soundtrack, and thinking about like what textures from this 60s horror fit into this Arthurian like westernized fantasy.
Do we have other questions?
Yeah, we have one other question from Jason Pitt at Genesis of Legend. How do you? I think this is for the publisher end. So for Jason, how do you unify the artistic styles from a variety of artists in your experience?
Oh, I don't. Yeah, I recognize that that's a thing that's done, but I don't want to do that. So in some of our games there'll be multiple artists, but they're pretty sharply demarcated in what they're illustrating. So for example, in Night Witches, we worked with Rich Longworth, who did very technical illustrations of airplanes and people flying and doing stuff like that. And we worked with Claudia Cangini to do portraits of actual people. And their styles were wildly different, but we didn't ask them to compromise their styles so that they blended together. We just gave them different things to do.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the right answer aesthetically, at least in my opinion. What do you think, Jabari?
I think that I agree. Like I feel like there's actually a way to get a wide stylistic variance to fit together across different artists if you're thinking from the beginning about like where each piece is going to go. What I actually see happen a lot is an artist is brought on because someone's really excited about them producing a certain image, but they're not sure like where that's going to fit into the book. And this is one of those things where I feel like, you know, like layout, like just thinking about layout while you're writing and producing after a lot of your design is done can really help your end product a lot because you know, like, okay, I want, like, you can make something feel really homogenous if you're like, I'm hiring this illustrator for chapter openers. I'm hiring this illustrator for all of the spots that have like my items. This is my portrait artist. This is my cover artist. This person's doing my end papers. All of those decisions look really intentional. And through that intention, that starts to feel really cohesive.
That's an awesome answer for sure. And it was a great question. And honestly, I would prefer to work with a single artist if I can. If there's an artist that sort of can do the various pieces, that coherence is important to me, and I would prefer that. Often that's not the case. In a game like Ghost Court, we were very lucky to get Richard Sala to do all of it, and it was wonderful. We have any other questions?
That is all the questions that
Okay.
I caught. So I think that might be it. If you want to just remind everybody where you can be contacted and how we can get your stuff and pay you for it.
That's right. We're gonna sign off. I think we may have lost Brennan. I'm not sure.
No, I'm still here.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay, that's great. Let me. So Jabari, why don't you start? Just give a pitch for yourself, and while you do that, I'm gonna just sort of cycle through some of the prototype cards from Dead House so people can see them. Go ahead. Tell us about yourself.
I'm Jabari Weathers. Once again, you can find my work at goblinprincet.com. Also, JMW Illustration leads to the same place. You can follow me on Twitter at goblinprincet. And feel free to shoot me an email at jmwillustration@gmail.com if you have questions about this process or working with me. And yeah, otherwise, I also sell originals, part of the reason that I work traditionally. So if you're looking for that as well, keep that in the back of your mind.
Okay, Brennan, I'm going to keep cycling through these
All
cards
right.
while you do the same thing.
Hey, that's nice lettering too. Works very well.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
We should probably mention that this is all custom hand lettering by Brennen Reece.
Yeah.
So
And
who are you and what's your deal?
yeah, so I am Brennen Reece. I am a graphic designer and illustrator. I art director at Bully Pulpit. You can follow me on Instagram at Brennen Reece, BRENNENREECE. You'll find one other guy who's a comedian with my name. That's not me. He's much prettier than I am. Buy lots of games. Support artists. We have some gift buying stuff coming around in about a month or so. Buy art for people. Buy original art. Support people who are making cool things. Buy cool games. Buy experiences. I'm not selling traditional stuff, but if you want to buy some weird prints of some retro beatnik jazz musician wizards or something, I've got you covered.
Sure. And I'm Jason Morningstar. My company is Bully Pulpit Games. We're at bullypulpitgames.com. You can also find us at itch.io or other big places that sell role-playing games. And we also have a Patreon. So come and support us on Patreon, where every month we have surprising and cool things that we're sharing, games, art. Brennan just did a big art retrospective of his spooky art for October. It's always a good time, so do join us on Patreon. And I think that's the end of our talk. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Jabari, for coming, and Brennan, and we will talk to you later.
Absolutely.
Bye,
Great
everybody.
to see you both. Bye-bye.
Enjoy METATOPIA, everyone.